Continuing with Part 2, Lecture 6. One is tempted to call this proposition an obvious platitude. What else can we say and think of being except that it is? The statement is not only self-evident, it remains totally vacuous. It actually tells us nothing. And what it does tell, we knew before. Being is sounds like rain rains. Of course, rain rains. What else could it do? And a thinker of Parmenides' stature is supposed to have uttered vacuities of this kind? Still worse, he is even supposed to have offered this vacuity as something it is necessary to say and think. Let us just suppose that Parmenides did utter the sentence being is, and did intend it in the sense we mentioned. Is it as vacuous, as easy to recite as it would seem? The phrase is not so vacuous as to say the identical thing twice with equal thoughtlessness. Even considered superficially, the phrase proves ambiguous. It may say, being is, meaning it is not so that being is not. What is stated is the actuality of being. But the phrase may also say, part of the fundamental character of being is that it is being. The what of being, its essence, is named in the is. Or the phrase may state both things at once, the fact that being is and what it is, its essential nature. Parmenides, it is true, speaks neither of the existence nor of the essence of being. To keep us from judging the phrase too lightly, let us try to clarify it by an example. We admit that in this case, the procedure remains quite dubious. There is a tree in the yard. We state the tree is well shaped. It is an apple tree. This year it did not bear many apples. The birds like it. The apple grower has still other things to say about it. The scientific botanist, who conceives of the tree as a plant, can point out a variety of things about the tree. And finally, there comes along a strange and curious human being and says, the tree is. It is not so that the tree is not. Now, which is easier to say and to think? All those things that have been reported about the tree from the most diverse quarters, or the phrase, the tree is? If we say this phrase, and if in the saying it is a thinking, and not just vapid talk, then I ask again, what about the tree is easier to determine? Its lovely shape and all the other things that can be perceived, or this, that the tree is? If we stop for only one moment to say the phrase, the tree is, saying it in terms of what the phrase says, we have already said is about the tree. And now we are faced with the question, clumsy but definite, what about this is, according to which it is not so that the tree is not? Where in the tree, or on the tree, or behind the tree, is this thing named by the is? We say is hundreds of times daily, of course, and even if we do not say it, we constantly and everywhere refer with the auxiliary verb to that which is. But can this fact alone, that we take the is so lightly, constitute any kind of evidence that the word itself has no gravity? Who would have the temerity to deny roundly and on no particular grounds that ultimately this auxiliary verb may even name the gravest and most difficult thing that remains to be said? Let us for the moment strike out the is, and the phrase the tree is. Let us assume that it had not yet been said. And now, let us try to say, the tree is well shaped, the tree is an apple tree, the tree does not yield many apples. Without the is in the phrase the tree is, these statements would fall into a void, taking along with them the whole science of botany. Nor is that all. Every human attitude to something, every human stand in this or that sphere of beings would rush away resistlessly into the void if the is did not speak. Without it, human nature could not even rush away into the void, because for the away there must have been a here. We note once more, the fact that we take the is too lightly is no proof that the is and what it names does not keep within it a weightiness that we can hardly ever weigh. But that we can take this is so lightly shows how much we still are in the constant danger of illusion. An illusion all the more deceptive because it does not appear even to exist. Yet it would be rash to derogate the appearance of that danger's non-existence as if it were something defective and baneful. That appearance and the apparent indifference of the is that goes with it may hold the only possibility for mortal men to reach the truth. The phrase being is keeps an infinite distance from empty platitudes. On the contrary, it holds the most completely fulfilled secret of all thinking in the first intimation of its statement. And still, the question remains open whether the saying of Parmenides demands no more than that we note the fact that being is. This is what we assumed at first, on the strength of the familiar translation. But every translation is already an interpretation. Every interpretation must first of all have entered into what is said, into the subject matter it expresses. Such entering is, in our case, presumably not as easy as entering an orchard and there to speak of a tree. To enter into what is said in the phrase being is remains uncommonly difficult and troublesome for the reason that we are already within it. But before we enter into the saying of Parmenides we have quoted, we must note that the saying is not offered by Parmenides as the expression of a demand he makes. Rather, the saying is addressed to Parmenides himself, for there soon follow the words, and other things I call upon you to take to heart. Who is this I? It is in any case a being who calls, in any case a call which speaks to the thinking thinker, and even speaks to him of ways. It shows him three ways, one which thinking must go before all other ways, one to which thinking must also pay heed as it proceeds, and one which remains impassable to thinking. The calling calls thinking to the crossroads of way, no way, and wrong way. But the way of thinking is of such a kind that this crossroads can never be crossed by a once-for-all decision and choice of a way, and the way can never be put behind as once for all behind us. The crossroads accompanies us on the way every moment. Where does this strange triple way lead? Where else but into what is always problematical, always worthy of questioning? By the words of Parmenides, it can be shown that he is subject to a call, that he recounts what is addressed to him in order to respond to it. But we prefer to give our attention directly to what is recounted here, and in and through it raise the question what it is that is addressed to him, rather than prove from the outside and at length and fundamentally in vain that what speaks here is something like a calling. Let us listen to the thinker's words. One should both say and think that being is. But how are we to hear without translating, translate without interpreting? Even if we were dealing with something a thinker said in our native language, it would have to be interpreted. We give attention to the saying while we are underway on the way of the question, what calls on us to think, in the sense of the proposition whose laws and nature are expressed in logic. But then, would we not be forcing Parmenides' saying from the start into a specific perspective that is solely determined by the prospect opened up by the way of our question? That is indeed the case. But it is not a defect which we admit only under stress. At most, we here encounter the same difficulty with which every interpretation has to struggle. But it becomes necessary here to point out an illusion to which we all too easily fall victim again and again. It is that we imagine we are approaching Parmenides' saying in an objective manner and without presuppositions when we take cognizance of it without any intimations and even without giving it thought. We take cognizance of it. We add it to the knowledge which we imagine we possess anyway of such matters. But this cognizance taking without intimations and questions, and seemingly not burdened with any prejudice, is in fact an interpretation as charged with presuppositions and prejudices as is possible in this case. It rests on the stubborn and widespread prior assumption that one can enter into dialogue with a thinker by addressing him out of thoughtlessness. And here, thoughtlessness is to be found not so much where someone untrained in philosophy asks his questions, but rather where every seemingly pertinent and apposite citation from all the world's philosophical literature is indiscriminately thrown in. But in what way are we to translate the saying? Only one way is open. Without regard to later philosophy and its achievements in interpreting this thinker, we shall try to listen to the saying, so to speak, in the first bloom of the words. We must be guided, of course, by a certain familiarity with all that has come down to us of Parmenides' sayings. This will remain in the background of the discussion to follow, but we shall keep the current translation in view, for the sake of contrast with the translation that we now attempt, and not in the conviction that we have thus fully confronted prevailing Parmenides interpretations. A full confrontation could not be satisfied with weighing the results of the various interpretations against each other. That would mean to neglect the main issue. Full confrontation consists in the critical analysis of the unspoken assumptions of prevailing Parmenides interpretations for which this is not the occasion. Every confrontation of two different interpretations of a work, not only in philosophy, is in reality a mutual reflection on the guiding presuppositions. It is the discussion of these presuppositions, a task which, strangely, is always tolerated only marginally and covered up with empty generalities. In noting this fact, let us also point out once more that the attempt at translation here proposed, it too, and it most of all, is possible only on the way on which we are already engaged when we ask the question, what calls on us to think? With this, the prior assumption of our interpretation is both identified and submitted for discussion. But it would violate the meaning of interpretation generally if we cherish the view that there can be an interpretation which is non-relative, that is, absolutely valid. Absolutely valid can, at the very most, be only the sphere of ideas within which we beforehand place the text to be interpreted. And the validity of the presupposed sphere of ideas can be absolute only if the absoluteness rests on something unconditional, on a faith. The unconditional character of faith and the problematic character of thinking are two spheres separated by an abyss. Every interpretation is a dialogue with the work and with the saying. However, every dialogue becomes halting and fruitless if it confines itself obdurately to nothing but what is directly said, rather than that the speakers in the dialogue involve each other in that realm and abode about which they are speaking, and lead each other to it. Such involvement is the soul of dialogue. It leads the speakers into the unspoken. The term conversation does, of course, express the fact that the speakers are turning to one another. Every conversation is a kind of dialogue, but true dialogue is never a conversation. Conversation consists in slithering along the edges of the subject matter, precisely without getting involved in the unspoken. Most textual interpretations, not only of philosophical texts, remain at the level of a conversation, which may often be rich and informative, and that, in many cases, is enough. In our case, it is not enough. We are posing a question. We are asking for the unspoken call that points to the beginnings of Western thinking, the beginning whose course we too today still follow in our thinking, though Western is for the moment submerged in European thinking. One should both say and think that being is. Now we must translate Parmenides' saying. What matters here is only the translation. We are still far from a formal interpretation, but even the translation must be careful in two respects. The first concerns the content of the saying. The second concerns the manner in which we carry it over from the Greek into our own language. 1. The content of the saying. It all too easily escapes us and slips away into obliviousness. It hardly offers enough purchase to our accustomed ideas to detain us. It offers us no food for thought. Why are we in danger of being done so quickly with a sentence such as being is? For one thing, because when we hear the sentence, we find nothing in it worthy of thought. We take the view that subject and predicate of the sentence are equally clear. Being, is there anyone who does not know being? And is, who cares? Considering we already have our hands full with what is, which also includes, after all, everything that has been and is coming, everything that is no more and is not yet, and thus is, in some way, always. We have done with this is even before it is spoken, and not only we. The danger of having done with things in this frivolous way has another and primary reason that in the course of 2,500 years, thinking itself has slowly become accustomed to the idea which the sentence states. Hence, the theory could arise that nothing further could be said about what the is tells us. Kant himself counts the words being and existence among the almost unanalyzable concepts. He speaks about it in a short, still underestimated work, which dates from 1763, 18 years before his principal work, Critique of Pure Reason, and is entitled The Only Possible Proof for a Demonstration of the Existence of God. Kant's judgment that being belongs among the almost unanalyzable concepts is indeed fully justified once we share his assumption that what the words being and existence designate can be grasped primarily and only in a concept. No wonder, then, that we no longer notice at all the unheard of sense of the sentence being is, much less are touched by it to the point where our entire nature is so shaken that it will never again be the same. Through the centuries, this sentence, in many vagrant variations and in many ways, has explicitly or tacitly been and remained the leading theme of thinking. Today, When talk about being and existence is practically a daily routine, we notice only the monotony of the sentence being is. At best, we are offended by the elusiveness of the apparent generality and abstraction it expresses. Indeed, the most emphatic reminder that what the sentence says in truth is something altogether different can for the present have hardly any effect. And yet, the day may come when someone will find the sentence astonishing nonetheless, and will notice that all the centuries that have passed away have not been able to diminish it, that unbeknownst to us, it has remained as problematic as ever. This is why the sentence still concerns us at this hour, as directly as it ever did, with one difference only. Formerly, a radiance all its own illumined what this sentence had to say, so that its problematic vanished in that light, in consequence of a strange darkening, which has nothing to do with a decline and fall of the West. That light later fails to appear. What the sentence says turns into the obvious. Being is. What else can being do than being once it is at all? Today, we want to know only why being is. And so we ask, by what is being caused? Being, after all, is the actual, and as such made actual and active, and is everywhere referred to causes. And in such formulations of our questions, we include as obvious that being means as much as actuality. 2. The translation of the saying. The sentence being is seems to occur in the translation. For this reason alone, the translation must meet unusual conditions. Since today's thinking still follows directly in the footsteps of this saying, even when it imagines that it need pay no attention to it, the translation is at no time purely a problem of the historical interpretation of an ancient text about which philologists disagree. In the case here before us, we shall attempt the translation along the way of the one question, what calls on us to think? The translation is of a special kind, because the saying in translation does more than convey knowledge of an earlier view of philosophy. But at the same time, the translation is nothing special, nothing worthy of distinction, for it stays within the problematic of the question that guides it. The explication of the saying remains within the mandate of translation. Continuing now, Part 2, Lecture 7. The saying becomes clearer if we take the liberty of inserting 3 colons to give a sharper articulation to its word structure. We shall also write the saying in 4 separate lines. Following the usual translation, fitted more closely now to the Greek text, the saying then runs, needful. The saying also thinking to, being to be. This arrangement does not make the content of the saying any clearer, nor is there any need for greater clarity at this time. Every man endowed with understanding understands what is being said here. What we may not understand is only this, that such a saying should occur at all in the works of a thinker, and right away we catch ourselves in the act of slipping past this thing we cannot understand. How would it be if we took this occasion to be astonished that seemingly so obvious a saying is pronounced with such emphasis in a thinker's works? How would it be if we were astonished about it, and let our astonishment make us aware that perhaps something problematical, something worthy of questioning is involved here? We just now stressed the structure of the saying only in order to get closer to the area of its problematic. The colons we inserted give a first outward sign of the manner in which the words are put in order relative to one another. In our saying, the words follow upon each other without connection. They are lined up side by side. The word order of our saying is paratactic, which means, just lining up words, phrases, clauses without any connection or contrast, just lining them up, paratactic, and not, as the usual translation represents it, one should both say that. By this both and that, the words are put in a specific order. The connection coordinates them, puts them together in an order. We speak of synthesis. The usual translation of the saying puts the words together in an order by inserting connecting words. In regard to its word order, the translation is syntactic. Syntax is the study of sentence structure in the widest sense. Our ideas of the structure of language are formed in terms of syntax. Where we encounter languages that have no syntax, we normally understand their structure to be a deviation from or failure to attain syntactic structure. Paratactic structure is found especially in the languages of primitive peoples. Paratactic speech occurs also in syntactically structured languages, for instance, among children. Then everything fits, since children too are considered primitive. A child might say about a passing dog, bow wow, bad, bite. The fact that an expression of early thinking speaks paratactically fits in splendidly with the common picture we have of those thinkers among whom Parmenides belongs. He is counted among the pre-Socratics or pre-Platonists. This is not just a chronological designation, but a downgrading, for Plato is considered the greatest thinker, not only among the Greeks, but of the entire West. Why? Not because his thoughts have ever been established as the greatest in terms of what the task of thinking is. I would not know how that could ever have been done by any thinker, nor would I know by what yardstick we could ever appraise any thinker as the greatest. As great, quite possibly, but thinking so far has presumably not even raised the question in what particular greatness of Plato's thought consists, assuming the greatness of any given thinking lies in the wealth of its problematic. Plato is considered the West's greatest thinker because Platonism, that is, those things which we subsequently adopted and adapted out of Plato's thinking and along with it, has undeniably exercised the most powerful influence on Western thinking. But are we really satisfied that the greatness of any thinking can be computed from the length and breadth of its effects and assessed by the volume of assent it has gained? And if effect and influence are to be our yardsticks, then what would Plato, and with him Socrates, be without Parmenides? Plato himself has kept his origins in mind and memory far more essentially than did the Platonism that came after him. The masters always have an indelible and therefore deeper knowledge of their roots than their disciples can ever achieve. But to this day, Platonism is struck with naked terror if it is expected to consider what lies behind this philosophy of Plato, which it interprets and posits as the only binding philosophy. If we do consider it, we can do it only in this way. We say that early thinking is not yet as advanced as Plato's. To present Parmenides as a pre-Socratic is even more foolish than to call Kant a pre-Hegelian. But equally mistaken is the reverse procedure into which we are easily drawn by any emphatic mention of thinkers such as Parmenides. We then adopt the view that the early thinkers, being first in point of time, are first and foremost in every respect, for which reason it is then deemed advisable to philosophize only in this pre-Socratic manner, and to pronounce all the rest a misunderstanding, a retrogression. Such childish ideas are actually in circulation today. We mention them only in view of the way which we are trying to take. When we take this way, we come to the point where we, in thought and inquiry, retrace the questioning of a thinker by starting from his own thinking and from nowhere else. This task differs in every respect from the frequently heard demand that we must understand the thinker in his own terms. That is impossible, because no thinker and no poet understands himself. How then could anybody else dare claim to understand the thinker, even to understand him better? The wish to understand a thinker in his own terms is something else entirely than the attempt to take up a thinker's quest and to pursue it to the core of his thought's problematic. The first is and remains impossible. The second is rare, and of all things the most difficult. We shall not be allowed to forget this difficulty for a single moment in any of the lectures to follow. To speak of an attempt at thinking is not an empty phrase meant to simulate humility. The term makes the claim that we are here taking a way of questioning on which the problematic alone is accepted as the unique habitat and locus of thinking. But in view of the rashness of our public, let us note also something else. It may easily happen that soon, even tomorrow, the slogan is promulgated, "Everything depends on the problematic." That cry seems to identify the crier as one of those who are inquirers. Today, every statement either becomes stale and irrelevant at once, or else stays caught in an insidious ambiguity against which the individual is helpless. We speak and hear the saying paratactically, but still in the usual translation, needful. The saying also thinking too, being to be. But we certainly do not take the paratactic to mean not yet syntactic, nor do we rank it as primitive. We keep it clear of any comparison with the speech of children and of primitive peoples. We also leave the question open whether, when a child says nothing but moon at the sight of the moon, or responds to the sight of the moon with a word he has made up himself, whether there is not at work here, for a short moment, a speech far more primary than in the most exquisitely wrought sentence of the man of letters. Is this a reason to elevate the speech and art of children to the principle of a new form of speech and a new art form? No. Such propositions stem from abstract considerations and are the exact counterpart of the fabrication of the age of technology, which are something else again than the essence of technology. We call the word order of the saying paratactic in the widest sense, simply because we do not know what else to do. For the saying speaks where there are no words, in the field between the words which the colons indicate. Parmenides' language is the language of a thinking. It is that thinking itself. Therefore, it also speaks differently from the still older poetry of Homer. We shall now follow Parmenides' saying word for word without taking the view that it is merely a sequence of words. The Greek word in this sentence, needful, derives from the word for the hand. I handle and so keep in hand. I use, I have use for. Starting with this use that is practiced by man, we shall try to point out the nature of using. It is not anything that man first produces and performs. Using does not mean the mere utilizing, using up, exploiting. Utilization is only the degenerate and debauched form of use. When we handle a thing, for example, our hand must fit itself to the thing. Use implies fitting response. Proper does not debase what is being used. On the contrary, use is determined and defined by leaving the used thing in its essential nature. But leaving it that way does not mean carelessness, much less neglect. On the contrary, only proper use brings the thing to its essential nature and keeps it there. So understood, use itself is the summons which demands that a thing be admitted to its own essence and nature, and that the use keep to it. To use something is to let it enter into its essential nature, to keep it safe in its essence. Proper use is neither a mere utilizing nor a mere needing. What we merely need, we utilize from the necessity of a need. Utilizing and needing always fall short of proper use. Proper use is rarely manifest, and in general is not the business of mortals. Mortals are at best illumined by the radiance of use. The essential nature of use can thus never be adequately clarified by merely contrasting it with utilization and need. We speak of usage and custom of what we are used to. Even such usage is never of its own making. It hails from elsewhere and presumably is used in the proper sense. Now, when this word is mentioned at the outset of a thoughtful saying, and this particular saying, we may assume without fear of being arbitrary that the using mentioned here is spoken in a high, perhaps the highest sense. We therefore translate it as "it is useful." The translation directs us to give thought to something that not only is not customary to our ways of forming ideas, but that must for the moment remain altogether unthought. It is useful. That sounds like it is raining, it is windy, it is dawning. Grammar and logic call such sentences impersonal, subjectless sentences. Needful, then, would be a sentence without a subject. Raining refers to no person. Accordingly, the sentence is impersonal. Or does rain rain the same way thunder thunders? Or does even this statement miss the mark? We are groping in the dark. The term impersonal, subjectless sentences determines only something negative, and even that, perhaps, inadequately. For in sentences of this type, there is always the it. Of course, one never ought to talk about the it so long as the essential realm has not been brought into view to which the word appeals. It, we explain, means the impersonal. It means something neither masculine nor feminine. It means neither of the two, but the neuter, of course. But since when has it been established that the personal and the difference of the genders are all we need in order to think the it properly, and that means to maintain it in its problematic, simply by contrasting it negatively with the personal and the genders? The fact that such statements as "it is windy," "it is snowing," "it is thawing," "it is dawning," and so on, speak with special urgency and frequency of the weather is something to think about. We must understand weather here in the widest sense of atmospheric conditions and storms that show on the face of the sky. Nobody would claim that grammar and logic have adequately elucidated the nature of these curious sentences. Adequately here meaning also with the necessary reserve, nor would it seem to be their business. It is useful. Who or what is it, we ask? And our question comes too soon and is too crude, for once again, without cause and without scruple, we accept it as an established fact that one can and may ask about this it exclusively in terms of what it or who it. Of course, "it is useful" does not speak of a phenomenon in the sky like it is raining. As the translation from the Greek, the phrase "it is useful" belongs rather in the company of "there is." This frequent phrase was mentioned when we tried to characterize what gives food for thought before all else, what is most thought-provoking. It gives us food for thought. Could it be that only when we have extended our quest, inquired adequately into use and usage, that only then the it in "it is useful" would achieve its radiant appearance? We therefore point once more to the high sense of use as we here say it. Even so, a more informal reflection on "it is useful" may bring us closer to the matter. It is useful means something more essential than it is needful, for Parmenides' saying is not concerned with a need in the usual sense, nor with a brute necessity, and least of all with blind compulsion. The phrase "it is useful" could evoke such meanings, but even then we must first ask, in every case, where that assonance stems from, and whether it does not give voice to an "it is useful" thought in a deeper sense. Such is the case with Hölderlin. We shall cite two passages from his poetry, but the remarks which follow do not mean to suggest that Hölderlin says the same thing, as though Parmenides' thinking could be interpreted by being traced back to passages from Hölderlin's poetry. In the last stanza of his hymn, The Ister River, Hölderlin says, "It is useful for the rock to have shafts, and for the earth furrows. It would be without welcome, without stay. There is no welcome where no meal, no food and drink can be offered. There is no stay here for mortals, in the sense of dwelling at home. If mortals are to be made welcome and to stay, there must be water from the rock, wheat from the field. It is useful for the rock to have shafts, and for the earth furrows. Shafts pierce the rock. They break a path for the waters. It is useful for the rock to have shafts, and for the earth furrows." We should be listening altogether too superficially and thinking too little, if we were to interpret the "it is useful" here to mean only "it is necessary." Shafts are more necessary to the rock than furrows to the earth, but it belongs to the essence of the welcome and being at home, that it include the welling of water and the fruits of the field. It is useful says here, there is an essential community between rock and shaft, between furrow and earth, within that realm of being which opens up when the earth becomes a habitation. The home and dwelling of mortals has its own natural site, but its situation is not determined first by the pathless places on earth. It is marked out and opened by something of another order. From there, the dwelling of mortals receives its measure. The key word in Parmenides' saying we now translate as "it is useful." Even on superficial examination, the saying speaks of stating and of thinking, of being and of being with a capital B. It speaks of the highest and the deepest, the most remote and the nearest, the most veiled and the most apparent that mortal tale can tell. To use means first to let a thing be what it is and how it is. To let it be this way requires that the used thing be cared for in its essential nature. We do so by responding to the demands which the used thing makes manifest in the given instance. Once we understand using in this sense, which is more natural to us, and in which using designates a human activity, we have already differentiated it from other modes of acting with which it is easily and readily confused and mixed up, from utilizing and from needing. In common usage, however, it means those things as well. A wide range of meaning belongs generally to the nature of every word. This fact again arises from the mystery of language. Language admits of two things. One, that it be reduced to a mere system of signs uniformly available to everybody, and in this form be enforced as binding. And two, that language, at one great moment, says one unique thing, for one time only, which remains inexhaustible because it is always originary, and thus beyond the reach of any kind of leveling. These two possibilities of language are so far removed from each other that we should not be doing justice to their disparity, even if we were to call them extreme opposites. Customary speech vacillates between these two possible ways in which language speaks. It gets caught halfway. Mediocrity becomes the rule. Commonness, which looks much like custom, attaches itself to the rule. Common speech puffs itself up as the sole binding rule for everything we say, and now every word at variance with it immediately looks like an arbitrary violation. The translation from the original Greek likewise appears arbitrary if instead of saying "one should," we say "it is useful." But the time may finally have come to release language from the leash of common speech and allow it to remain attuned to the keynote of the lofty statement it makes, without, however, rating customary speech as a decline or as low. It will then no longer suffice to speak of a lofty statement, for this too is, at least in name, still rated by low standards. Why this reference to language? In order to stress once again that we are moving within language, which means moving on shifting ground, or still better, on the billowing waters of an ocean. It is useful. Thought in its high signification, that means to admit into essential nature and there to keep safely what has been admitted. To attune our ear to this meaning of the word, we shall try to clarify it is useful by means of two passages from Herderland's poetry. One passage is from the hymn, The Ister River. It is useful for the rock to have shafts and for the earth furrows. It would be without welcome, without stay. In this passage, the useful designates an essential community of rock and shaft, earth and furrow. This essential community is in turn determined by the nature of welcome and stay. The welcoming and the staying are what marks the dwelling of mortals on this earth, but dwelling, in its turn, is not grounded within itself. Heidegger breaks off here and then continues this thought in Lecture 8.